current national minimum wage is 27 rand 58 cent. That is after an increase this year from 25 rand 42 cent. That is, the hourly rate of the worker, which translate approximately to 4,633 rand. If you assume that these are workers who work a normal 8 hours over a period of 21 days each and every month. However, we've got to state that this obviously excludes whole categories of workers. These are workers, domestic workers, and including this, the EPWP workers, and so on and so on. So, for instance, the minimum wage for the EPWP workers has increased, to 15 rand 16 cent from 13 rand, just below 14 rand actually. And there are also wages, but I think that you could argue they are even slightly better. That is a schedule of minimum wages for whole categories of workers, but the basic one is that. It is on annual basis. It has to be reviewed, it has to be adjusted. Obviously, inflation is one of those issues, the cost of living in general. But that's what they say. The question is, what is the reality? In the past, with the exception of this year, we've seen minimum wage increases that were well below the inflation rate. This year was slightly above inflation rate, but remember, this is above inflation rate of workers at a very meager wages, and for whom, in actual fact, when you look at inflation, their wage overall was still well below. Their increase was well below the real inflation for that category of the population and the workers. Just to take an example, 60% of the national minimum wage, or of the income of the workers on national minimum wage, is spent on electricity and transport. Now, electricity this year alone increased by 12.7%. And when you look at the cost of transport, because of the increases in fuels, diesel, petrol, both for private transport, but also for public transport, which is what many of these workers are relying on, in the form of taxis in particular, in the situation where in the railway and the train infrastructure is being ruined and many of it don't function in key metropolitan centers. The trains between Johannesburg and Pretoria have not been working for a very long time, and I think the situation is increasingly so in Western Cape and other areas and so on. So most of these workers rely on taxis, and the price, or rather the taxi fares, have been increasing from the last estimates, I think that was 2 years ago and so on, was at the region of about 20-something%. And, although, understandably they might have fallen with a better prices of, oil last year, I still expect that they are well above 10%. Now, when you take account of the fact that this is where workers spend bulk of their income, alongside food, food inflation remain close to 10%. So you'd realize that although the increases this year were slightly above the official inflation rate, the real inflation, the real cost of living of these workers has skyrocketed well above the adjustment that have been made. So the adjustment that have been made in the final analysis are made, like every other decision of government, in the interest of the capitalist class, in the interest of corporate profiteering of those interests that have monopolized all the key sectors of the economy and employ labor solidly for the purpose of exploitation, not to create jobs or to provide livelihoods for workers and their families. They can be paid below that minimum wage, but that is provided the employer doesn't apply for exemption. There are provision for exemptions, but the national minimum wage is supposed to provide a floor below which nobody can be able to go. But I've already mentioned that quite a number of workers are outside of that. They are earning even appalling wages. But also, the minimum wage itself is I mean, appalling, is extremely low, well below the upper bound of poverty line, which is estimated to be at 1,950 rand per person per month. I mean, that is 65 rand per person per month. Now, when you take the minimum wage of 4,633 rand, right, that the worker earn, and you divide that on an average of a family of about 4 people, right? That is a worker, the wife, and the 2 children. But we all know that that's not even a realistic picture of many of these workers on minimum wage for many reasons. One, because the workers in many of that category, on average, will have 3 and more children, not 2, in a typical nuclear, middle class family. Secondly, is that the level of unemployment, the devastating levels of unemployment, is borne by the workers precisely in these categories. They have to take care of many dependents, the sisters, the brothers, the siblings, the parents, and many others. But I'm just saying, even if you assume the small family of 4, the worker, the partner, and the 2 kids, right? Even if you assume that, you then take the minimum wage and say, what does it translate into in relation to the poverty line of 1,900 or close to 2,000? I mean, that poverty bound line, if you like, the upper bound line of poverty, translate into about 8,000 rand the minimum wage for a worker who is responsible for 4 people or the family of 4, himself or herself, right? But when you extrapolate that into the real situation of majority of these workers, it's even worse. But just on that basis alone, it means that this minimum wage actually is equivalent to half of what is required just to ensure that the family is below is above the upper bound of the poverty line. So, overwhelming majority of these workers are these workers are what you call the working poor, and they make 50%, if not more, I think up to 60% of the entire working populations. Other are not better. 75% of the workers in this country are earning just around 6,000 something rand. And I think that is an indictment on the capitalist system in this country, which remain 30 years into democracy. A neo-colonial capitalist economy that is engaged in a regime of primitive accumulation and its enslavement of the black working class, particularly through a system of a cheap migrant black labor that condemn the majority of the workers to condition of an absolute poverty, hunger, and starvation, even for those that are fortunate to be working. Legally speaking, you could approach inspectors of the department, right? But those are awfully inadequate. One, because of lack of capacity constraints, capacity constraints, resources within the Department of Labor. But in the final analysis, the only solution is for the workers to organize and mobilize, and don't more. You either organize or starve. That's a simple but a stark choice that the workers are facing, because we have to remind the workers again and again that their power lies in their organization, in their unity and determination to struggle and to fight to better their conditions of employment, but also to improve the overall their overall lot in society, not just as workers, but their families and their communities. Absolutely. That's what trade unions are there. We are there to ensure that workers, um, their rights are protected, both in terms of basic conditions of employment, and that range from the issue of the working hours, making sure also that they don't work outside of the hours of employment. That is an 8 hour, a day, except in those areas where there's agreement in terms of the night shifts, 45 hours a week, if I'm not mistaken, 40, I think a week. No, 40 hours a week, that is over a period of 5 days. And that their entitlement to break, to lunch, but also conditions of health and safety are very important, because employers in pursuit of profit, they sacrifice the health and safety of workers. And that was much more apparent during COVID. Today, of course, COVID is still here, but we know a lot about it. But we know that in the middle of a COVID pandemic, when very little was known about this virus, its basic genetic structure, if you like, or its basic structure is it, how, what it does to the body and so on, but also how it's spread, right? Employers insisted that workers have got to go back to work. They rationalize it on the need to keep the economy going, to keep people in jobs, to ensure that people are, eating and all of that. But from their point of view, it was solely about profit. So just as they sacrificed many workers during COVID, that is what they do on a day-to-day basis, where they cut corners. And that's the reason that we have such an appalling record of health and safety, with high levels of accidents, many of which are deadly in the mines, but it's true also of many other industries. But also it's about better wages and conditions of employment. It's about benefits. In a situation wherein public health care is poorly funded, many clinics and hospitals are collapsing, we are fighting for access to medical aid. We are fighting for housing allowances. We are, saying that there must be a whole range of benefits that can improve lots of workers besides just wages themselves. And we want workers to have provident funds. Many workers, right? Big number of workers have no retirement benefits, either pension or provident funds. And when we look at what the state provide by way of pension, many of the workers, after a lifelong contribution to economy and the wealth of society, they retire, in dignity of not being able to provide and take care of themselves, but having to rely on a pitiful, state pension and so on. We find that they get pension and so on. So there's a whole lot of things that a trade union movement does, and it's very important to underline this fact, particularly in a situation where many people, and particularly young people, that have not seen the power of the organized working class in its heyday, have lost faith and confidence. And I must say, with a great sympathy, that quite understandable, because many of them who grew up in post-1994 era, all that they've seen is union collaborations with brutal neoliberal restructurings of government in a post-1994 period, which translated into collaboration and betrayals of workers, in workplaces, workers, organizations or trade unions that rely more on the support of the employers than on the workers that they have to organize. And we've seen the most bloody consequences of that policy in the mining industry again, which, because of its position in South African economy and its regime of accumulation, what we call the mineral energy complex, it is an industry that concentrates all the contradictions of South African capitalism. The bloodiest consequences of that policy was the Marikana massacre, because people say, mine workers were killed for 12,500. That's true, but it's not really true. when the workers went on the strike, it wasn't so much about 12,500, right? They wanted better wages. But like all the workers, they set the 12,500 as a negotiable amount. Obviously, the 12,500 assumed a different meaning altogether after the massacre, when the workers now understood it is cast in stone with the blood of the martyrs of the American. But in the beginning, it was another starting point in negotiation like any other. Now the question is, could the mining industry afford those wages? Yes, of course they could afford. Not only because many of that, mine workers today are earning those wages, and the industry is not collapsing. If anything, it continues to be profitable. Like in 2022, I think, Anglo Platinum registered a profit of 79 billion rand, against the background, obviously, of good commodity price and boom, right? But also internationally, most of these mines are from Australia, BHP, Bilton, and quite a number of them. In Australia at the time, I remember I did research, and an average general worker in Australia working for some of these very same companies was earning an equivalent of 1.2 million a year, right? A general worker. A truck driver in the mine, 1.4 million a year. Today, those mine workers in Australia probably they earn 2 million. Of course, there's issues of productivity, which has nothing to do with the willingness of the workers to work hard, but poor levels of investment, in the social productivity, but also productivity of labor. But the real issue here is that the reason you had the Marikana massacre was that the employers and the state was defending the political architecture for the management of capitalism in the post-1994 period, which relied on the NUM, on COSATU, in holding down the workers dissatisfied with the conditions of their slavery, with the poverty wages, with lack of health and safety at work, with precarity of employment, with many workers being in labor broking and all sorts of outsourced services without those kind of benefits and so on. So it's unions, and their collaboration with employers that have made many young people to be skeptical about the trade union movement. But even there, we've got to remind, these young people and many of those that are skeptical that if it was not for the organized black working class and its colossal organizations of labor, we will not even be where we are, talking here like this in freedom, 30 years into democracy, with all the rights that we have. But also, not just what we've achieved here in South Africa, every element of civilization that we take for granted today, public health, public education, retirement benefits, access to clean environment, water, all of these things were conquest of an organized working class that just were just not given. There were the struggles that working class people waged, right? When you look at the history of the labor movement and go to old countries of capitalism, your Britain and all those things and so on, where you had child labor, workers earning, young people working and dying in the mines at an early age of 7, 8, 9, 10. All of that is gone, right? You had a situation wherein people had no leave days, both maternity but also normal leave days, had no sick leave, they had no access to healthcare, they had no access to public education. All of these are the conquest of the working class, and that's the reason we say organize your staff. And on the basis of organization, unity, and struggle, we can be able to make headways. We can move forward in achieving a lot than what we've achieved thus far. Absolutely. But I think, as I've said, again, the problem is, these issues of, inspectors. So it's supposed to be a very simple thing that you take a phone, you phone a labor department, and the labor department bring the inspector at your work. But it's not as simple as that. Because of intimidation, because of lack of capacity, but even in some cases, bribery. But think about this practical scenario. Less people think I just promote unions for the sake of them. And of course, I do promote unions because I think working class people without their organization, they are nothing. Let's be clear about it. A lawyer, a doctor, or some middle class, resourceful person may be able to do certain things to assert their rights and claims in society on the basis of individual efforts. But when you are poor, it's only on the basis of organization and collective strength of organization that you can be able to claim and you can be able to assert your rights, including a right to a minimum wage. So think about this scenario, right? You take a phone, you call Department of Labor. When the Department of Labor comes, who does the inspector meet? Yeah? The inspector is going to come, is going to go right to the office of the management, and is only going to be able to meet with the management to discuss your complaint because you have two options. You can be able to say, hey, I'm the one who raised the complaint. As an individual, you're just going to be targeted, you're just going to be victimized. Or you can rely on the inspectors checking books, doing their own work. Now, employers manipulate books. Employers are creative in accounting, that they can make a wage of 20 Rand a month, make it in the books appear to be 50 Rand or even 100 Rand, right? So, without a union, without an organization which, when the inspector comes to work, can be able to say, wait a minute, there's a union, these workers are organized, these workers are represented, I need to be able to meet with the shop stewards. And the shop stewards and the union officials are able then to present the evidence of these wages, the violation and the breaches of the law on the part of the employer. Without that, you are likely to end up with a complaint that yields nothing by way of action or consequences for the employer. Well, again, I've got to bring you back to the question of the union. Because, there's no any other school out there for the workers' movement and the working class other than its own organizations. Under capitalism, the very people who own the economy, that is, the people who own the mines, who own the banks, who own the farms, who own the factories, the transport companies, and the people who employ us, the bosses, they also, through the medium of the state, own the education system, own the media, and have control over many other, means of production and reproduction of knowledge in society. Now, with the exception of this media that we're trying to build as SAFTU, right? The mainstream media is owned by the same bosses who own other industries as well. Education system as well is there. I lecture at the university, I often, like everybody went to school, I can tell you that they're not going to teach you how to fight for your rights against the very people that actually employ the people in media, but also employ your parents and so on. They are also not going to teach you how to fight for your rights as a worker who is trying to challenge their power and their right to exploit you, because the right to property, which they talk about every time they talk about the rule of law and order, which is a capitalist, law and order, which means basically that the capitalist class should continue to have a monopoly over private ownership of the economy, and anything that challenges, anything that destabilizes that is considered to be unlawful, is considered to be unruly, is considered to be an upset on the rule of law and order. Therefore, the only schools, the only schools of political education, of political strategy, of political actions are the very organizations of the working class. It's trade unions, and of course, for communities fighting for right to housing and other things, because we must make these connections, right? We must make these connections. just a discussion on the national minimum wage tells you a lot about how the struggle for a living wage cannot be confined to a workplace only. Think about it. SAFTU demand 12,500 as a minimum wage. Now, that is triple what workers are earning as a national minimum wage at the present moment. But let's say they get it. Let's say they get it. What does it mean for a worker who, on average, has dependent of 8 people because of the levels of unemployment, of the siblings, of the parents, of the children, right? Of the partner, right? What does it mean? Will he be able to afford to take the kids to school? Will he be able to afford quality healthcare services for their children, where the local hospitals and clinics are not functional, are collapsing, and all of that? Will he be able to afford to make sure that he buy a quality, a food and diet for a proper nutrition of the family? Will he be able to afford a decent housing in the conditions where the housing market is privatized, is commodified, and if anything, lots of these bubbles that are happening because of financial for the economy means the value of most of the properties, and especially the houses. I remember between 2002 and 2008, they increased by 224%, right? So many of the working class people are priced out of the housing market, even in townships where lots and lots of that housing stock is bonded and therefore commodified. So the struggle for a living wage is also a struggle for a social wage. It's a struggle for a free public housing. It's a struggle for a free basic water supply. It's a struggle for a free basic electricity supply. It's a struggle for free education. It's a struggle against unemployment. It's a struggle for quality public health care for all. So these are the struggles that working class people have to be involved in, both at workplaces but also in communities. Because even as I said, we get 12,500. That will not be able to make sure that the worker has a decent house, access to education, all those things. And it's only when we win the struggles at that level of free public services, electricity, water, education, that we can really transform the lives of the workers. But ultimately, the task is to overthrow capitalism, because it's not only the primitive accumulation in the economy that flow from the logic of neo-colonial capitalism in South Africa. It's also the fact that global capitalism is facing organic crisis. And Marx, and we don't often do this, that is to apply the laws of capitalist motion as outlined by Marx to the historical process or the history of capitalism itself. But there's an important law that Marx called the most important law of a modern political economy, that the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall compelled the employers to consistently attack the wages of the workers, their conditions of employment, in order to cut the cost and to compensate for a decline in the level of profitability, because that is the reason that the capitalist class are in business, to make profit and more of it if they